everybody.
Hi. Sorry, I had
live.
a tech difficulty there.
Sorry about that. We had to switch computers. Here we are. Can you see behind us our slide deck? We're going to share the slide deck with you live. No, that didn't make sense.
No, we'll share it with you after we
That's what we're
when
gonna
we
do.
post the video.
Yeah, what she said.
Okay. So today we're going to talk a little bit about communication. We're going to talk about the behavior analytic approach to communication. We break down communication into what we call verbal operants, and we're going to go through all that today and talk to you about how we would teach communication as well through those lenses.
So feel free to ask us questions here that won't be part of the recording that goes up on the Google Plus community, so nobody will know that you asked it. Or feel free to actually post anything you need on the Google Plus community because I have it open on my phone, and we'll see your questions coming in there.
Last night, just a quick reminder, I posted, if you're having difficulty logging in, it's possibly because, well, you're watching this now, but maybe later you'll see this. It's possibly because your Chrome extension does not have a YouTube app. So if that's the case, try adding YouTube to your Chrome extension.
We are super excited today to be going live from St. Elizabeth Ann Seton in Barhaven.
And a nice little crowd here.
Yeah. So thank you guys for coming out early to hang out with us and learn about communication. We're going to get rolling quickly because we're a little bit behind. So how do I get rolling on your computer? Oh, there we go. Okay. So first we're going to talk a little bit about, I don't know if you can see the words behind us, but hopefully you can. We're going to talk about the behavior analytic view of language, which is a bit of a departure from a typical view of language. But as behavior analysts, a huge part of our practice is communication and language. And we very much look at that as something called verbal behavior. So when we're studying language, we really look at what verbal behavior, how verbal behavior is impacting the student. And you'll very rarely ever see a behavior plan from us that doesn't include some kind of a communication goal or a language goal, because it really is one of the best ways to target any kind of problem behavior to reduce it. So.
Yeah. And don't get stuck on the word verbal. It's not all about actually being verbal. It's about the approach to communication.
Yeah. So basically what verbal behavior is an approach to teaching language. And it's based on the idea that the meaning of the word is found in its functions. So when we talk about functions of language, we're not talking about eats, escape, attention, tangible, and sensory. What we're talking about are what Marilyn referred to as verbal operants. So we're going to talk to you a little bit about verbal operants without hopefully losing you in the technical language, but describing why we teach language the way we do and why behavior analysts in general approach language in the way that we do.
Yeah.
So we see a whole bunch of people signing on. Hi. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. So basically, when we're talking about that the meaning of a word is found in its functions, we're talking about why it's so important to know how a student is using a word, not just the fact that they can say a word, because as we know, a lot of students can say a lot of words, and it doesn't mean that they're using them in a functional way. So in order to teach a child with language delays the meaning of a word, we have to first teach the verbal operants, and we teach them very systematically. Here we go.
Having a little bit of announcement.
So instead of just teaching what a word is, so teaching a student to say the word toilet, we also have to know how we're going to approach teaching them the function of that word. So does the student say toilet when they have to go to the toilet? Does the student say toilet when they're labeling a toilet? Does the student say toilet when you ask them a question about tell me something that's in the bathroom or something like that? And they're all very different functions of the word toilet.
And especially with students with a speech delay or a language delay of some type, just because they can label a toilet doesn't mean that they can then ask to go to the toilet. So we very much look at how they're using that word because of its importance on its function. So if they're asking to use the toilet, that is a functional skill that they can now access a toilet. Whereas they're simply labeling a toilet, that's not as important to us to start with.
And when we're looking at verbal behavior and what the function of the words are, that's really a huge part of our practice when we're analyzing and assessing language. So when we're using different tools such as the ABLES, for example, the assessment of basic language and learning, one of the things we're doing is trying to find out how the student is using the words that they're using, and if it's in fact functional. So when you hear behavior analysts talk about functional communication, or for you RBTers out there who learned about that kind of stuff in your course, that's what we mean by functional communication, is using it as a mand, a tact, an interverbal, an echoic, etc. And we'll learn a little bit more about what those are.
Yep.
And then we're going to finish up with an example of how you would teach a neurotypical student language, or how they just learn language without needing to explicitly be taught, and how it's such a departure for the way that we have to approach language with our learners with the language delay.
Yep.
So if there's any questions, feel free to ask us. Same with you guys who are here. Just raise your hand and be brave if you have a question.
So first, we're going to talk about the different types. We have a little chart back here of verbal operands. So we're going to talk today about mands, which is a request. So, for example, asking for something. Tax, interverbals, echoics, and autoclistics. So we're going to go through each one here, and we're just going to go through the ABCs. So what the antecedent was for that, what the behavior was, and what the consequence was, and then we'll give you an example. So the first one we're going to talk about, which is you'll probably hear every single time we're in your class, is talking about manding, requesting. So for that, the A, so the antecedent, is the motivating operation, an MO, which means you're motivated for something, you want something. The behavior is the request. So that could be a verbal request. It could be a lead. It could be a peck. It could be a sign. It's showing us that you want that item. It's a request for it. And then the consequence is directly getting that item. So you can see how that would be very different from some of the ones that we're going to move forward. So for example, a child comes into the kitchen and says to the mom, "I want milk." That is the mand. The antecedent was they wanted the milk, and the consequence was they're going to get the milk. So for us, that's how we would describe a mand, a request, using ABCs.
So when you're learning about PECs at phase 1, or you're learning about manding, like one-word manding programs, really that's what we're teaching. We're teaching that basic ABC contingency, which is why we have to set up opportunities for them to be motivated for something, usually prompt the mand or prompt the exchange at first, and then reinforce them quickly with the item so that their brain starts to learn that this is the stimulus response stimulus that gets me something at the end of the day.
Yeah, and this sounds very kind of kindergarten, but of course, this depends on the language or the level of language that they currently have. So we're still at this level sometimes, depending on the age, up to 15, 16, if they don't currently have a communication system.
I was at a student, in a classroom, in an ECL classroom yesterday, and there's a 19-year-old that doesn't have language. So we're using one-word manding, and probably starting on phase 1 of PECs, just to clean up the articulation of the mand, and then we'll fade to the one-word mand. So this is a 19-year-old student who does not currently have a communication system. So
no matter the age, we're still starting at this developmental level.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I would say that the number one practice of any behavior analyst is, does the student communicate? And if not, how we need to get them communicating. And if they already are communicating, analyzing where they are basically in the verbal operants and teaching where we need to.
And sometimes we'll come in and say, we're just going to introduce a communication system. We don't feel the need for a behavior plan. And it's often because without that communication system, no behavior plan is going to work, because then you're just teaching compliance or you're teaching lack of a problem behavior. We really want to give them a way to systematically be able to access what they need, whether it be escape, attention, or a tangible as well.
And that was behavior analysts maybe 25 or 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. They would go in and only deal with the problem behavior. So all the research since then is pointing to, you have to teach functionally equivalent replacement behavior, and that for 99% of our students is a way to functionally communicate with their environment. So the second verbal operant is tacting. Tacting just means labeling. So that's, once your student has a really good manding repertoire, then they can start engaging with the environment around them and labeling things. And you'll see here that the feature of the physical environment is the antecedent. So it's your student just looking over at something. Right now I'm looking at a black chair. The behavior that I then evoke just by seeing the black chair is saying, "Oh, chair." And the only consequence here is social. So we're going to get to in a minute why social can be so hard for many of our students who just are not motivated by social, hence why language, they are so delayed in language, and why language acquisition can be harder for them. One of the examples is the student looks out the window, he turns to the teacher and says, "It's hot today." And the teacher says, "You're right." That's all the teacher's going to do. She's not usually going to give him any tangible reward for labeling the weather. And so you have to have a student that is motivated by social, or we can bridge it from there, give him something tangible and bridge it into social, which we'll talk about in a minute.
Yeah, we will. And note that the feature of the physical environment could be something that you see. It could be something you hear. It could be something that you taste. It could be something that you smell. So me saying like, "Oh, it tastes chocolatey," that is also a tact as well. So we're labeling any feature of the environment.
So for those of you who have attended PECS training either in the spring or in the fall, you'll see that this equates roughly to a PECS phase 4, phase 5, getting into tacting. So you'll see that really Manding is such a foundation of language, and that's why phase 1, 2, and 3 really are based around understanding how to communicate, or that exchange, that I need to deliver a message to another human. And once a student can learn that, then it opens up to other types of communication.
And because the mand itself, the consequence is actually getting that item, it's more motivating to want to learn that than it is to label items, because that doesn't get you anything when you're first learning language.
Right.
So next, our next verbal operant is an interverbal. So this is a conversational skill. This is back and forth. So for example, if I said, Jen, how old are you?
35.
Oh, sorry. I didn't
Thanks
actually. She could have said 25. But she does not, she didn't need a label. She didn't need anything to label. She's simply answering that based on her knowledge of a back and forth conversation. So the antecedent for that is a person's language. So me saying, how old are you? The behavior is, I'm 35. And the consequence is me kind of giggling that she said she was 35 and very honest with everyone. And so the consequence, again, is a social reinforcer and possibly some of my language. But again, she's not accessing any tangible for that item.
Right. So next is echoic, or the ability to imitate. And so imitation is not usually something that comes easily to many of our students because they're not socially motivated, which is the usual reinforcer for an imitation skill. So the common A is verbal behavior of another person. So you have to be motivated by what's happening around you and be attuned to what's happening around you in order for that antecedent to be the case. So Marilyn teaches me to says something in French, let's say. I don't know if you know French. Oh, okay, good, easy. You can do this. The behavior I then evoke is bonjour. And the consequences, maybe she smiles, maybe she gives me a thumbs up, maybe she says, great job, that sounded somewhat okay.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. The example here is, the teacher says to a student, behavior in German is, I'm not going to try to say it, the student repeats it. And the teacher says, you're right, that's correct. So as you can see, an echoic skill is further down the line of where we need to go with our students, starting with the first verbal operant of Manding.
But often we will see students who are echoic simply because they have learned to repeat that language, possibly because they like the sound of it or something else. But what happens is that language is often misconstrued as being functional, and it's often not. So
that's echolalia.
Echolalia, yeah. So it's a delayed echoic. So for example, say they really love Dora. I keep going back to Dora. I know that's like, I don't even know if Dora still exists, but say they still really love Dora and they're singing Dora, Dora, Dora the Explorer. You may hear that multiple times throughout the day, and it's a delayed echoic. So it's just a longer time in between the time that they heard it and they've repeated it. But that skill is actually not very functional for them to access Dora, because when they say that, people don't then bring them Dora. They're not actually labeling Dora because Dora is not actually there right now, and there's no conversation going back and forth. So that's how you know it's an echoic.
Mm-hmm. And so part of our assessment when we're looking at language is assessing not only where the student is in their verbal operants, but if that echolalia exists, then we have to put it under specific instructional control. So we basically have to change it from a sensory function to a social function, because we want students to imitate us, but not just for the sound of hearing it over and over again for like an automatic reinforcement function or a sensory function. What we want is for them to understand that you saying that language actually means something to the environment around you, and teach them why that's important. Whoops.
Oops. Pop-ups.
There you go.
Okay, and last but not least is an autoclictic. So this is so a person's own verbal behavior is the antecedent. The behavior is the autoclictic, and then it is the consequences. It's directly effective. So I'm going to give you an example because this is a little bit harder to describe. So the example that we give here is a child comes into the room, his parents' bedroom at night, and says, "I think I'm sick." So their verbal behavior of feeling sick and then saying that they think they're sick is the behavior. And then the consequences is effective because the parents would then say, "Oh, you're sick. What's wrong?" Like, how, possibly ask them more questions. So it's similar to an interverbal, as in there's language before and there's language after. But the difference is more of a predictive in the middle. So you're more predicting. So I think it might rain tomorrow. I feel, like, it's more of a predictive than an actual fact, which is more of the interverbal. Does that
So
make sense?
if you think about how abstract that is for our
Yes.
learners and how much of a foundation you need to build with the other verbal operants before they can do things like label their own emotions or
yes.
tell you when their leg hurts. So oftentimes that is a very noble cause to pursue to teach a student, but there's so many verbal operants that just have to be mastered first. And these verbal operants in general follow the typical development of a baby, a toddler, etc. Good morning. Hi, we see everybody saying good morning to us. Thank you for joining us. So the difference is that most students don't need to be explicitly taught these things because they're learning from their environment. They're socially motivated, but their observation skills are well developed right from infancy. So they are learning really through observing their environment. Whereas with our students with a language delay, they are falling behind because they're not learning that way. They just simply do not learn that way, and we need to explicitly teach them. And behavior analysis specializes in how to teach them these new behaviors, which are verbal behavior.
Yep. So we're going to now talk about some...
Any questions?
Yes, sorry.
We're kind of running through verbal operants really quickly. Anyone who took the registered behavior technician, I believe they get into verbal operants. Hopefully
yes,
they do. Yeah. And we do support that further learning about verbal operants on the registered behavior technician Google Plus community that we have, which I think we have, 88 people on now, which is great. So if you've taken the RBT, then please join us there and we'll go into more detail. Really, we're framing this around some examples we're about to give you.
Which is the more functional part for you to understand where the examples are coming from. But first, we had to describe what the different...
Dive into what we think about behavior and communication.
Okay, so now we're going to go over how a neurotypical child or adult or person learns language, what the differences are in the middle column, and then how we would teach language for someone with a language delay. So a neurotypical person would learn language through social reinforcement. So like we said, a lot of the other four, other than Manding, are reinforced by that social reinforcement. So, oh, you're right, that is a chair, or yeah, it is raining outside.
Or just simply a smile or a nod is enough of a social reinforcement for our brain to say, oh, I'm going to do that again next time because I'm very motivated by the social.
Yeah. Or even just the response. So Jen answering me when I asked her how old she was reinforced me for asking her again because she did give me that response. This is usually learned through exposure and through modeling. So young children, they pick up the phone, right? And the first thing they say, hello, right? Because they've seen you do that. So they're learning that early communication skill just by watching us do that. I mean, I guess probably they pick up the phone and text now, but it's still a skill that they're learning through imitation. And next, what they do is they generalize that skill. So for young children, the first time they see a dog, oh, it's a doggy. And we're like, yeah, it's a doggy. Everyone's super excited. Then they overgeneralize almost to everything's a dog. So then they are saying, oh, there's a four-legged animal. That's a dog. Oh, there's a four-legged animal. That's a dog. We then say, oh, that's a cow. Now they know that because it's been modeled to them once and they're able to generalize that skill very simply to all the other toys.
And they can recognize the neighbor's dog, even though it looks different than your dog, would still be called a dog, or a dog in a book, even though it's completely not tangible, is still a dog. So typical kids can learn that way, or neurotypical kids can learn that way and generalize super, super well. And I think we take for granted a little bit the value of the ability of natural generalization.
Yeah. And think about something as simple as colors. When you teach them a color in one crayon, they automatically know everything in the room is blue and everything that's gray and everything that's red and everything that's green, simply by showing them one time, like, oh, this is the red one. That's pretty much all the teaching that needed to be done. A simple model, and then they're generalizing. The difference, what we're seeing, so this is our middle column, is children who have a speech delay typically are not as attuned to or as motivated by social reinforcement. So this doesn't mean that they don't love their hugs, their cuddles, all this, but it's not actually functioning as a reinforcer.
And we're talking more specifically about students with autism, typically here.
Yes. And so this doesn't mean that, they don't love some social. It just means it's not functioning as a reinforcer for that skill. So it's not increasing that skill for them. The second is they have a skill deficit in imitation or modeling. So often, again, kids with autism have a really low repertoire of imitation. So they are not imitating our mouths, they're not imitating our gross motor, they're not imitating our fine motor. And part of the reason for that is they're not attuned to the social part of it.
Yeah.
And last but not least, there is a huge skill deficit in generalization. So as you know, we're teaching for generalization at the beginning, but the key part of that sentence is we're teaching generalization from the beginning. Typically, generalization is just a skill that comes along as typical development does.
So you don't need to explicitly teach it, whereas we really do.
Yeah.
So you can see that neurotypical language development happens, and it's a beautiful thing because you don't need to do too much explicit teaching around it. And it really relies heavily on exposure, modeling, and generalization skills. And where our students have huge deficits are in learning through exposure, modeling, and poor generalization skills. So that kind of leads us to why behavior analysts have such a different approach to teaching language and really viewing language development. So the first thing is that we have to teach language through explicit reinforcement. And it's not that we don't want students to eventually be reinforced by social engagement and social praise. We do, which is why we heavily pair any reinforcement that we give. So when we're teaching a student, anything from Manding right down to autoclitics, we always keep in mind that, of course, the end goal is social reinforcement for most of those goals. But right now they need a tangible reinforcement because that's what means something to them right now. We can't control what a student is motivated by. So that's why you'll see sometimes we say, give him pieces of a puzzle, or give him sometimes candy, or something that speaks to him as a reinforcer or her as a reinforcer, and pair it with high social praise so that later on when we drop the tangible reinforcer, the social praise is what's maintaining the behavior over the long term. So it is the same goal as a neurotypical student eventually, but just at the beginning, we have to teach it more explicitly, and we have to follow the student's lead on what they find reinforcing.
Yeah.
Which
is why we teach Manding first, because there is that tangible reinforcer to provide.
Yeah. And if a student can get Manding and get a really good repertoire of Mands going, then we're like, okay, we can go with this. This is really good. Okay. So the second thing to note about how behavior analysts approach language development is we use evidence-based teaching procedures. So there's been 60 years of research in behavior analysis that proves what's effective and what's not effective in how to teach language, specifically with students with a variety of language delays, but more specifically autism. Prompting, prompt fading, imitation, if your student has imitation skills, stimulus transfer, shaping, all these different things, which again, we're not going to get into detail with, but we use very specific procedures based on assessments for each individual student. So in behavior analysis, we never take research that's done on 300 students and just apply it to one. We always do student-specific language assessments. The ABLES, for example, will give us a really good sense of where they are with their verbal echoics, where they are with all of their different imitation domains, gross motor, fine motor, all that kind of stuff, how they can receptively identify things, and how they're using expressive language in all these different areas of verbal operants. So, and the last thing is we have to plan to teach generalization from the start. So, and we do have to teach generalization across all verbal operants. So a neurotypical learner knows that when I say mama, this might be my mama. And when I see a picture of her, that's still mama. And I might even generalize it to a book where it has like maybe a mommy bear and a baby bear. And I might look at that and know, oh, that's a mama too. And when I see other people in the environment that have babies or kids, and I'm recognizing that same dynamic, I can generalize that to like, oh, that's a mama and that's a mama. And that's what you were talking about, the overgeneralization sometimes, is that like every woman becomes mama soon to like the neurotypical baby or toddler. Right. Whereas our kids, and so that's transferring across operants. So I say mama when I want my mama, which is a mand. I say mama when I'm labeling my mama in a picture or across the room, which is a tact. I say mama when someone says, who is this? And I say mama, that's an interverbal. So as you can imagine, when we break down language and all these different functions of the word, just simply the fact that the toddler can say mama doesn't mean much to us until we figure out how they're using the word or what the function is. And for our students with autism or a variety of other language delays, they don't easily generalize across those verbal operants because they're not learning those in the same way. So it's extra work for us to have to plan that strategically. And the most effective way to teach any lesson is to teach one at a time. So anybody who attended PECS training will know that we teach one thing at a time because we want it to meet mastery and to build a good foundation before we then build on it. So that's why we start with Manding. once we have a solid foundation of Manding, then it's like, okay, now let's see if we can get some labeling in the environment and get some social reinforcement flowing. So,
and just because a child has done something once, often with autism, doesn't mean that they're able to do that skill repeatedly. And so sometimes in a plan, you'll see something, for example, of being able to ask for a better way to get attention, or ask for a better way to get a break. And the reason for this is that although they do have that skill of saying, for example, I need a break, it doesn't mean that they're using that skill with the function to actually get a break and get out of the classroom or go sit down or whatever it is that they need. And so that's often where we kind of are training that, so that when they receive the break, that is the reinforcement for getting that break, versus just kind of repeating it over and over and not actually accessing anything for it. So that's where the communication part of a plan might come into play as well. Even though they do have verbal skills, it's possibly that they've just never applied it to that situation. And so we're actually teaching that specific situation.
So I think about the student that can list off the classroom rules but can't follow them.
Right.
It's a breakdown in verbal behavior. So we assess what is the breakdown in the verbal behavior, because just having a student repeat it back to you or having a student recall it on their own has really no bearing on what their behavior is in the schoolyard. And all of you know that. You've learned it the hard way, I guess. Yeah.
Another breakdown of verbal behavior, very similar to what Jen is saying, is if we ask them, what should you have done right after it happened? They can typically tell you what they should have done, but they can't do it in the moment. So that's a breakdown of verbal behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So next.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Oh, no. Oh, one too far.
Oh, there we go. Wrong one.
We have 3 different examples that we're going to go through. One is manding, one is greetings, and one is responding to name. These are 3 kind of common things that we see as a priority, that you usually identify as a priority when we're in your classroom, but also that we would definitely identify as a priority. So we're going to go back to the chart and work through each of these examples and spend a few minutes on each one, just kind of explaining how the neurotypical brain learns it, what's different about our students, and why a behavior analytic approach is such a departure from how we typically view language development.
Okay.
So the first one I'm going to do is manding, which is, again, requesting. So when we look at a neurotypical language development of manding, learns through social reinforcement. So this is your baby who, when they say mama, mama, what typically happens if you're in another room? You come, right? And so that functions as a mand, a request for mama. And the reinforcer is social. Hi, baby, how are you? Oh, aren't you so cute? And if we just go straight across, when children are not attuned to the motivation of social reinforcement, and this is typically when you see students with autism who are diagnosed later, and we look back at home videos from when they were 9 months old or 10 months old or even younger, we see that this is where the social breakdown began, which is they may go, mama, 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 and you come in the room and go, hi, babe, it's me, mama. And nope, they are not reinforced by that. In fact, sometimes because they find that level of attention and pressure of social or social engagement, that actually might function as something that's not reinforcing to them and brings them further away from ever wanting to do that again. So this is the students that you hear about who, like, he said mama for a while there, and then it just dropped, and now he doesn't talk at all. It's because he wasn't socially reinforced by using those words, and his brain shut them off. So how this is different for our students who we have to bridge into social reinforcement is we have to teach them manding. If you want mama, mama comes, but mama comes with good things, because the good things is really what's mostly reinforcing to you. So we have to pair it with mama, and then we fade the things slowly once you're like, you know what? Anytime good things come, mama comes, and then it becomes reinforcing. So it's just a totally different approach to learning. And this is part of the struggle, I think, with sometimes when parents have a toddler or a student with autism, is because you have to teach that social reinforcement. It's not innate, and they're maybe used to their other kids or other people's kids having such a social reinforcement as their base. So that can be really hard.
So it's also a matter of teaching the person who's engaging with that student how to reinforce differently, because as humans, we're typically, we reinforce with social reinforcement more often than not as well. Yeah. And so it's a different way of us learning how to reinforce the child as well. That's hard.
And so when you're looking at a neurotypical student, they learn through exposure and modeling. So they learn to say the word mama because mama is modeling the word. Other kids might be saying the word mama or calling her mama. And that's just how they eventually go, oh, their brain says, well, I'm going to try to try to evoke that same behavior, which is the word mama, and the social reinforcement comes. But because our students have deficits in imitation and or modeling, they may never say that word. Okay, so they may never actually even develop the skill because they are just not learning through that way. So we have to explicitly teach them through prompting, through prompt fading. As they get older, stimulus transfer from the stimulus of the reward to the stimulus of the person, things like that.
And if they do imitate that word, often what happens is they imitate that word more of a sensory function. And so the word just becomes mama, 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 which is really fun to say. However, they're not pairing that stimulus, mom, with the word mom. So it's not actually functional.
That's right. And so generalization to all verbal operants. Again, that's the example with I say mama and mama comes to me, which is command. I say mama when I'm labeling her, which is attacked. I say mama when I'm communicating about mama. I can receptively identify when someone says, go crawl over to mama. She's got your toy or whatever. The toddler or the baby might crawl over to mama. So all these different things across verbal operants are naturally happening. But again, because our students have such skill deficits in generalization, what that actually looks like is we have to explicitly teach that this is mama and she offers you things. She comes prepared with good things to reinforce you when you do mand for her. But also then labeling mama is a totally different skill. And we have to explicitly teach that separately to the student. And again, build in some extrinsic reinforcement to then hopefully build into the more natural social reinforcement. So we have to really go out of our way to teach. And then just because you can say mama doesn't mean you can answer a question like, who is this? Oh, mama. Tell me who your parents are. Mama, dada. Like it just does not generalize to all those skills. They have to be explicitly. That kind of stuff. It has to be explicitly taught as a separate skill. It's not just bridging on its own.
Yeah.
So that kind of gives you an idea of neurotypical language development of a mand, which is usually that mama is one of the first mands that you develop, or milk, or dada, or baba, or something like that. And how that kind of bridges into so many more language skills kind of on its own without too much intervention, whereas our students need a lot of intervention to get there.
Yeah. Okay, so our next example we're going to talk about is greetings. So we're going to go through greetings and response to name pretty quickly because we're going to run out of time here. Greetings basically is learned through social reinforcement for typical kids. So when you say, hey, Jody, hi, and that is all it takes for that greeting to continue. Often also with a greeting comes a little bit of hugs, maybe a high five, something else along that way. So all that social reinforcement is motivating it. How do we learn greetings? Well, as young as a little baby, we're saying, hi, hi, hi. And the first thing the baby does is waves back. As soon as that baby waves back, we're in Disneyland. Oh my gosh, he waved back to me. That was enough of a reinforcer for that to continue along the way. As for generalization, they start to learn that everyone that they wave to gives them that same reaction. So I'm going to do that across my day. My 2-year-old still waves at the dog. I mean, she still thinks that the dog's going to give her some reinforcement for that because waving to everyone helps, So that's a generalization skill that she has made, that over time, that the more people she greets, the more attention she gets.
And they can easily generalize types of greetings. People go, hey, how are you? Is the same as going, hi.
Yeah, I don't have to explicitly teach my 6-year-old that, hey, hi, how are you? All are functions of hi. She has just learned that through modeling. So those breakdowns and those skill deficits in social reinforcement and modeling, our typical learners are not reinforced by that hi. And they're also having to be taught separately the difference between saying hi, so initiating a greeting, and responding to hi. Those are two very different things. One is initiating social reinforcement, and the other is responding to social reinforcement. And those are very different. Typically, we would teach responding first because we can pair that with a tangible reinforcement. So we can give them something for saying hi to us. And then we can also pair that with the hi, and then eventually we drop the tangible. That's easier to teach. The harder part to teach is initiating, because that part is only met with the social reinforcer, and that's much more difficult skill. So you have to pair the social reinforcer in the response and then transfer that to the initiating. The problem with greetings in general is that they also can become very, what we call like punishing. Although it's not a punishment, we're not hurting the child, but it's very negative for them to have to say hello sometimes, especially depending on what that reaction is to follow. So
if you require them to look in your eyes or wave, or you stop and you're this close to their face and you're like, say hi, Billy,
right.
That can be pretty,
it can be intense.
Functions as a punisher.
Yeah, it can be, So we have to really take a look at what their social motivation is that they like. Do they just simply like you saying hi and then that's it and we move on? Or do they like that little bit of a show? So we're going to assess their preferences for that before we teach that skill.
And keep in mind, greetings is an interverbal skill. So if your student hasn't built a solid foundation of manding and tacting, it's going to be very difficult for them to read all the A's and C's, antecedents and consequences around the behavior of initiating greetings or responding to greetings. So just keep that in mind, because sometimes we jump to that because we value it as a social reinforcer for ourselves. When I say hi to someone, I do expect them to say hi back. And we want our students to live up to the social the social norms around them. But at the same time, we have to do that in steps, and we have to respect where they're at with their verbal behavior for sure.
Yep. And the last part is when we talked about that greeting of being able to generalize the different types of greetings. So hi, a smile, high five are all different types of greetings. So we want to make sure that right from the beginning, we're teaching all those different greetings are the same as hi. And so that we don't have to individually teach them all.
Yeah. And never, when we teach a skill like that, would we allow the response to just be nothing. So the more that someone says hi to a student and their response, they don't respond to it, the more that they just learn that that's not functional for them and they don't have to really participate in that. So that's why the ABA teaching strategies are so important, of how you're prompting, how you're fading, how many times you're saying an instruction, all of that stuff becomes critical, because research shows you have to teach it through a very specific way if you want the student to learn it, and not just learn it rotely, because some of our students will learn that skill rote. Someone says hi, I say hi, and I keep going. And they're not actually socially reinforced. They just know that that's the expectation and I have to say it regardless. And it's not natural. And that's your student who you're going to have a really hard time ever getting them to initiate a greeting, because they haven't learned to respond in a natural socially reinforced way. So
and the other thing with a greeting, and because it's an interverbal, is you cannot prompt a verbal. You can't prompt someone to speak. So what you might want to start with is something as simple as
you can't force them.
You can't force them to speak. And so what you might want to do is start with something as a receptive skill, like a wave back, because you can in fact prompt that, and then move along to more.
So teaching this, if someone said hi to Marilyn and she's my student, and and she's already got a good manding repertoire and a pretty good tacting repertoire, and I've chosen this as a goal. If someone says, hi, Marilyn, good job waving, would be the antecedent. As someone says hi, the behavior I want her to evoke is at least a wave. Okay, at least a wave. And then the consequence is, good job, because again, an interverbal functions only on social praise. But if I'm teaching it and it's new, as soon as she waves, she gets a Lego, or she gets a sticker, or she gets whatever it is that I'm pairing with good job waving. So that's kind of roughly how we would teach it. The last one is responding to name. I'll go through this pretty quickly here. Neurotypical language development, they learn responding to name. Well, you don't need to go too far to teach it, because what happens is, if I'm walking by my baby and I say, hi, Billy, or Billy, and Billy looks at me, again, that functions based on a social reinforcement. Mommy going, oh yeah, hi, it's me, right? And anybody with a baby knows all those moments where you're giving so much social praise for all those little skills. They come to you, they look at you, when they're responding to their name. And so the student learns that the child learns, when I hear Billy, good things come. Right? When I hear Billy, mommy smiles, daddy smiles, grandma gets excited, the video camera comes out, like whatever. So they start learning that all this social reinforcement is tied to responding to their name, either looking or saying something or coming towards whoever called their name. And they learn this through exposure, through modeling. They generalize it well, so that when they come to school, someone calls their name, they usually will turn around and look at you when they're in kinder. They're not going to go, oh, I have no idea what that means. Of course, that's my name, and I know that I'm supposed to respond to it. Where our students break down is they're not attuned to the social reinforcement piece. They're not learning through imitation and modeling, and they have deficits in that generalization piece. So when we look at, again, tying value to it, number one, we always say, if you're going to teach responding to name, you actually have to do the opposite of what you think and stop calling their name. Stop calling their name just randomly around the classroom for no reason, because they already have, by the time they get into school, they already have a learned history of, number one, when someone says Billy, I'm not reinforced by what happens afterward because I don't really care. That's not reinforcing to me any social things that happen afterward. And number two, usually I've paired it in my learning history by then with a demand. Billy, come here. Billy, sit down. Billy, get off the table. Billy, stop doing that. And so even if at one point I was responding to Billy, I'm certainly not now by the time I'm in school, because my learned history is just that when my name just is simply an indicator that demands are coming. So why would I respond to my name right now? So when we're teaching response to name, we actually have to flip that a little bit and not call their name at all, unless if I'm teaching this to Marilyn and she loves iPhones or iPads, she's already looking toward me, right? And I would just go, Marilyn, and just pair. The only time she hears her name in a day is when good things are coming toward her. That makes her more likely then for me as I'm teaching several days later. And again, you need to teach this stuff like 20 to 50 times a day, right? Think about how many times you teach a student addition in a day, how many trials you do to really get them flowing with addition. So same thing with these kind of skills. It has to be lots and lots, especially because the neurotypical student is going outside and adding snowballs and adding things in their head as they look around the room and the environment. And our kids aren't doing that because they can't generalize the skill. So of all the times you're teaching a neurotypical student an academic skill and all the practice they need to master it, half of that practice is happening when you didn't explicitly plan for it. That's not happening with our students. So we have to explicitly plan for it. So eventually Marilyn might be looking this way and I might go, Marilyn, yeah, with pairing again the social praise, because like that's what we want to fade it to. But I got to give her something tangible that she actually cares about to pair her name with that. So really kind of that's how we bridge that. And don't forget, just because you're teaching her to respond to her name doesn't mean she's going to receptively identify her own picture. It does not mean she's going to expressively identify herself in the mirror, let's say. It does not mean that that's going to generalize to any other verbal operant, because as we know with our kiddos, that's not the case. So sometimes we teach a skill and then we're a little bit disappointed or surprised when they haven't generalized it, because we kind of forget that all of the energy and time it took to teach them that one specific skill and that one specific stimulus, it's not going to just generalize on its own. So
the other thing that doesn't generalize is distance. So distance for greetings, distance for responding to name. We have to make sure that right from the beginning, so for responding to name, we're teaching it right beside them because we're giving it. And then eventually we're going to make sure that we fade that and continue to keep the close and the further away calling to name so that they can respond to their name wherever they are in the room eventually.
Yeah. So we are out of time. So we are going to share the slide deck on the ABA Plus Google community. And what we're going to do is we put the live links in here. So if you're talking about Manding, if your student doesn't have that basic verbal behavior skill, you can teach them Manding. We have 2 videos that are linked here of Marilyn and I showing you how to teach Manding 101. And we have a teaching Manding protocol that we've written up, and it follows, like if you have a sign language learner, if you have a verbal learner, if you have a PECS user, these are the same protocol, and we have examples for each different type of communication in there. And then we have a link here for the ABA Training Google Plus community, where we will further support specifically Manding, because that's where most of our students are at.
Yeah.
But if you have questions about any of the other verbal operants or any of the ways that we would use behavior analysis to teach language, then you can engage with us there.
And you can also send us an email if you have a question. Just make sure that you don't use any identifying information if it's not one of our current students.
Yep.
Yeah. All
That's
right.
it.
So thank you for coming, and we will post the video very shortly live or on the Google.
Yeah, we both said live.
Yeah.
We opened this live and closed it live.
Yeah.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Okay, that was good.